This is the Good Neighbor Podcast with Jesse Sadirgo. Welcome to this series on practicing presence that I'll be visiting time to time on this podcast. In this series, I'll be sharing monologue reflections drawn from my research and writing over the past few years, pieces that have mostly lived on paper, in files, or tucked away in my dissertation that very few people will likely read. So this podcast is a way to bring those ideas into real conversations. I want to give you a glimpse into what matters most to me when thinking about community care. So I'll be working through a lot of these concepts and inch my way through the different writings that I have done throughout the years. I like to start by kind of sharing a bit of the background that you might have heard in different episodes beforehand, but it all begins with my time as a director at the Drop-In Center for Street-Involved Youth in the downtown of Toronto. I had the privilege of working alongside many different outreach staff and many people who were just amazing people who demonstrated these qualities that were hard to describe. And these qualities enabled them to foster these very trusting relationships that were very fruitful with our youth. Their skills, their instincts, and their discernment, particularly their discernment, felt seasoned and homegrown. And it enabled them to navigate very precarious situations regularly in our center. Our staff, they developed really strong relationships on the streets and over meals in our drop-in space, engaging in friendships and mentorship and advocacy and support. And at times, it was hard to distinguish the roles that they were playing in the lives of these youth. Were they a friend or a professional worker? Were they a mentor or a social worker? In my attempt to address this ambiguity, I actually noticed myself and my inclination to think, okay, what's a professionalized version of what they're doing here? How can I professionalize the functions of these staff? Because I wanted to maximize their effectiveness in bringing about social change. I sought to clarify the roles that they were playing in the lives of these youth. I wanted them to establish very healthy boundaries that would benefit both the youth and the outreach staff. It was my view that formal credentials, best practices, and contractual clarity would produce systems that would combat the malpractices and abuse of power and prejudice that I've seen play out multiple times in different kind of organizations. Because when you leave it unchecked, relationships without boundaries, they are ripe for conflict and harm. Therefore, my goal was to monitor. I wanted to standardize. I wanted to reproduce the fruitful relationships that I witnessed in the drop-in center. I didn't want to necessarily be surveilling over them for the sake of keeping them only in check, but also I also wanted to see how the good things I saw could be reproduced and maximized to make greater impact, because that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to change the world, right? So in my attempt to tame and organize the complex relational dynamics of this community, I found that my efforts were continually stifled by the nuances and contingencies found in these relationships, much of which refused to fit my neat systems. I felt like I was chasing the wind, or attempting to catch magic in a bottle. The trust and fidelity between these staff and these youth, they always seem to color outside the boundaries of professionalism. And it became evident that their mode of relationality could not be codified as much as I tried to do it. I noticed that the most seasoned staff were almost speaking a different language, one that resonated with those on the streets much more than they did with my systems. And so although it was kind of unrefined sometimes, the way in which they would go about things, I found that the cadence, the tone, the body language were very welcoming to those on the margins. The best word that I found to use to describe it was the vernacular. And this is a term used by the historian and social critic Ivan Illich, who I researched a lot in my dissertation. And it's a fitting term to describe what was taking place in the drop-in center that I was witnessing. According to Illich, the original use of the term vernacular concerned, and I quote, whatever was homebred, homespun, homegrown, homemade, as opposite to what was obtained in formal exchange. Okay. So it is the language and the way that we speak in the home before we were introduced to, for example, like very formal standardized grammar. It is like the very intimate language that can be detected and discerned and identified by those closely related in a community or in a household. So the question that we'll be working throughout this series concerns the subtle movements we have made to a more professional, formal, scalable, measurable approach to care. The kind of language that is standardized. Like, why do we move in that direction? Because like fish in water, it's hard to detect what we're swimming in, right? We have naturalized industrial ways of knowing and working in the very human endeavors of caring. And I would argue that scaling back that propensity to formalize our practices is getting harder. Like, it's getting much harder to do in our society. I did this in a post a few weeks back by referring to my friend Bill Ryan, who reminded me of the wise words of Jeff Goldblum in the first Jurassic Park movie. Remember the very cool scientist with the sunglasses? And he says in a scene, he says that your scientists were so preoccupied with whether or not they didn't stop to think if they should. And I think that is the ethical dilemma that we'll be wrestling with throughout this series. The other picture that I have is from another book by Richard Sennett called The Craftsman. And Richard Sennett paints the picture of a woodworker in his or her small workshop. And I quote, the woodworker is menaced by a furniture factory down the road, end quote. I love the image because the image is of this crafts person who's like very committed to the task at hand, taking pride in doing the job well for its own sake, just doing a job well done and making something beautiful. But this craftsperson is like troubled by the new forms of efficiency and production that seem to bypass the habits and the skill of her craft. And like a craftsman, seasoned outreach workers, I believe, in the social sector are looking down the road to a more industrialized version of their work. And they're attempting to articulate all the compromises that take place when the craft of engaging people in their most vulnerable state is being reduced to a best practice and scaled to a degree that exceeds the limit of due diligence. Like all of the work that is put into and the discernment put into all of these ways in which we engage very sensitive matters. It's just like being disregarded or skipped because we're just looking to just best practices and implementing them in this very industrial way. And so what do we do with this seasoned social craftsperson working on the assembly lines of these charity industries? I'm seeing it more and more, like people who are very seen and know how to discern, they're being placed in situations and in industrial forms of care that they don't know how to function in anymore because it is too boxed in. It's not something that they can be able to play within or to be able to improvise within. It's hard for them to know how to function in it. And so the question is like, how might the discipline, the character and affection of this craftsperson prove consequential in an industrial age of efficiency and mass production? How can we find that once again? Because what we are coming to and already sitting in today is that we've naturalized the very concrete and digital way of life. We are native in the industrial realm, the very digital realm, and we are very foreign in the natural, right? When we go to nature, it's just very hard to function in it. When we do things in a very vernacular way, it doesn't feel right anymore because we're just so used to a very formal industrial way of engaging community. So in this series, we want to go a little analog. All right. We want to consider perhaps a subsistence-based way of working in this world where we create just enough, where we set aside our industrial tools that leverage and maximize our power and lean into a more piecemeal, small scale kind of movements, right? Actions and initiatives that may actually have a very short shelf life. That's the difference between an industrial way of living in this world and a subsistence-based. A subsistence-based way, for example, agriculture, is just making just enough, right? Making just enough to eat for your family. You don't have much surplus. But like, what if like community care is living off of much more of that, temporary, short expirational dates? What if that is in our care as well, where it's like it cannot be mass produced, where our minds are not rushed to the future or visioning too far ahead or reaching for the stars? That instead we might stay grounded within the borders of our community, reaching as far as our arms can stretch, speaking as loud as our voice can carry, and loving as much as our heart can handle. What if we remain within the human finite limits that we have? So that's what we'll be talking about throughout this series. I might go in and out of this and other, podcasts that are more interview based, but I wanted to take these monologues to kind of break down some of the things that I've been thinking through. And I hope to be able to be in conversation with many of you who are listening to get your thoughts into it. Like, what do you bring to this that could like bring more to the conversation and breathe life into the reflections that I have here. So thanks for listening in. I hope that you're subscribed to the podcast or to the YouTube channel so that I can hear more from you and so that you can hear updates of what moves on from here. All right. And if you'd also like to get a rundown of all the work that I'm doing, feel free to engage my website at goodneighbor.to. Good neighbor is spelled like a good Canadian. Okay. We have an OU, not OR. So goodneighbor.to. And you can see all the things up there as well. All right. So thanks, everyone. Thanks for listening. See ya.